Daniel Carter sat in his car, gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. Outside, the house was dark except for the faint glow from the bedroom window upstairs, the same window where his wife, Emma, slept, or at least where she tried to. Daniel knew she hadn't been sleeping well. He hadn't been either. His reflection in the rearview mirror was unrecognizable, a ghost of the man who had once come home in his dress blues, kissing his pregnant wife with the promise that he'd always be there. A man who had sworn he would never be like his father, never abandon the people who loved him. But that promise was cracking. The nightmares, the panic attacks, the feeling that he was trapped in a life he didn't deserve. It was all suffocating him. He had been trained for war, not for this. Not for a world where he was supposed to be a husband, a father. Not for the day when Emma had excitedly shown him the ultrasound. 4 heartbeats, she had whispered, tears in her eyes. Daniel, we're having 4 babies. He had smiled, kissed her, held her tight. But inside, terror. How could he raise 4 children when he could barely function in his own skin? And so, with a quiet sigh, he made his choice. Daniel stepped out of the car, one last glance at the home he had built, the home he wasn't strong enough to stay in. He slid an envelope under the door, knowing it would never be enough, and then he walked away. Emma woke up to find the note the next morning. It didn't explain much, just a mess of scrawled apologies, empty words about how he loved her, how he loved their unborn children. But he couldn't be the man they needed. She screamed, threw the note against the wall, and in that moment, something inside her shattered. The small town hadn't changed much, but Daniel had. His beard was thicker now, streaked with gray that didn't belong on a man his age. His body still bore the scars of war, but none cut deeper than the guilt he carried every single day. He didn't come back for forgiveness. He knew he wouldn't get it, but fate had other plans. It was a simple errand, picking up supplies from a local hardware store. He had kept his head down, wanting to be invisible. But then, he saw them. 4 kids laughing, running around in the park across the street. His eyes locked onto them, and something inside him froze. They were his. He knew it instantly. The same eyes, the same face. His quadruplets. The children he had abandoned before they ever took their first breath. His chest tightened as he took a step forward, then stopped. Because standing nearby, watching them carefully, was Emma. She hadn't seen him yet. But when she did, her expression turned to stone. For the first time in years, Daniel Carter felt fear. The world had become a blur of cities, cheap motel rooms, and gas stations. Daniel Carter had learned how to live without roots, how to drift through places without leaving footprints. It was easier this way. No attachments, no explanations, no past to answer for. The years had stripped him down to the barest version of himself. A man with a packed duffel, a 1,000-yard stare, and a past he never spoke about. But fate had a cruel sense of humor. It started with something small, a craving for coffee. The diner sat off the main road of a town he had never planned to stop in. He slid into a booth, back to the wall, habitually scanning the room for exits. The waitress took his order without looking up. That was fine. He didn't want conversation. Then he heard them. Laughter, 4 voices. Something about it pulled at him. Not just the sound itself, but the rhythm of it, the way it mixed together in a way that felt too familiar. He turned toward the commotion outside the diner window. 4 kids around 8 years old chased each other around the sidewalk. 2 boys, 2 girls. Something about them stopped him cold. Daniel squinted, his stomach tightening. The faces, the eyes. His mind screamed impossible. One of the boys tripped and a woman ran up, fussing over him. Daniel saw her face and felt the air leave his lungs. Emma. She hadn't changed much, still had that quiet strength in her eyes, but there were lines now, shadows of exhaustion and years spent alone. The sight of her, standing there with 4 children that looked so much like him, made him feel like someone had dropped a weight on his chest. He did the math in his head, the timeline, the kids' ages. Oh God, they were his. His hands trembled as he reached for his coffee, his fingers suddenly numb, useless. He had left before they were born. He had abandoned Emma when she was pregnant. And she hadn't been carrying 1 child. She had been carrying 4. Daniel couldn't breathe. His first instinct was to run, to vanish before she noticed him. but his feet refused to move. Instead, he watched, frozen, as Emma ushered the kids into a nearby bakery. She looked tired but content, the kind of exhaustion that came from carrying everything alone. He had done that to her. Every year that he had spent wallowing in his own misery, believing he was better off alone, she had spent raising 4 children without him. His stomach twisted. Then, as if feeling his stare, Emma suddenly looked up, her eyes meeting his through the glass window of the diner. For a moment, the world went still. Her expression went from confused to shocked to something darker. Daniel saw the moment she recognized him, and he saw the moment rage set in. She turned, ushering the kids away faster now, her shoulders tight with tension. Daniel shot up from his seat, his pulse hammering. He didn't know what he was going to say, what he could possibly say, but he had to try. By the time he got outside, she was already walking fast, dragging the kids along. "Emma," he croaked. His voice felt rusted, broken. She stopped in her tracks. Slowly she turned. The quadruplets, his children, looked between them in confusion, their eyes filled with curiosity and something Daniel didn't deserve. Emma's face twisted into unfiltered fury. "Leave," she said, her voice razor sharp. Daniel swallowed. "Emma, please." "You don't get to talk to me. You don't get to look at them." The quadruplets stared up at her, then at him, their young faces full of questions they didn't understand yet. Daniel felt a pain like nothing he had ever known. "I didn't know," he whispered. "I didn't know about them." Emma let out a bitter, hollow laugh. "And that's supposed to make it better?" He didn't answer, because it didn't. "Do you know what it was like?" she continued, stepping closer now, her voice shaking with rage. "Carrying them alone, giving birth alone, watching them grow up and knowing their father didn't care enough to stay?" Daniel felt the gut punch of every word. "I did care," he rasped. I just..." Emma's jaw clenched. "You just what, Daniel? Tell me." He had no answer, because there wasn't one. "Don't come near us," she whispered, eyes blazing with pain. "You walked away once. Do it again." She turned and walked off, pulling the kids with her, leaving Daniel standing alone on the sidewalk. This time, he didn't run. He stood there and let the weight of his choices crush him. He had seen his children for the first time, and he had lost them in the same moment. Daniel sat in his truck across the street from the school, gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. The laughter of the kids playing outside felt distant, drowned out by the war inside his head. They were right there, his children, 4 of them, quadruplets. The life he had abandoned, standing just yards away from him. He had spent years convincing himself that leaving had been the right choice, that they were better off without him, but seeing them, knowing they had grown up without him, made the regret unbearable. Daniel was about to start his truck and leave, again, when a voice startled him. "You've been watching us all week." Daniel turned, his heart nearly stopping. One of the boys stood outside his window. It was Liam. The boy had his arms crossed, his face unreadable, but his eyes held something dangerous. Recognition. "You're him, aren't you?" Liam asked. Daniel swallowed hard. He hesitated. "I'm your father." The words felt foreign, unnatural on his tongue. Liam didn't react the way Daniel expected. No anger, no yelling. Just a long, measured silence. "Why did you leave?" Daniel exhaled, pressing his forehead against the steering wheel. "Because I was weak," he admitted. "Because I thought you'd be better off without me." Liam narrowed his eyes. "And now? You think showing up now is going to change anything?" Daniel met his gaze. "I don't know," he whispered, "but I want to try." For a moment, neither spoke. Then Liam nodded, just once, and turned away. "Come to the park tomorrow, if you really mean it." And just like that, he was gone. The next day, Daniel sat on a bench at the park, waiting, dreading. And then they came, all 4 of them. Liam, Noah, Avenue Grace, his children. They stood at a distance, watching him like he was a stranger, which, to them, he was. Daniel took a deep breath and stood. "I don't expect you to forgive me," he said carefully. I want to know you. If you'll let me." The silence stretched between them. Finally, Ava stepped forward, arms crossed. "Mom says we shouldn't talk to you." Noah smirked. But we don't always listen to Mom. Grace, the quietest, looked Daniel up and down. You look different than I thought you would, she admitted. Older. Daniel let out a shaky breath. Yeah, life does that to you? Liam, still standing back, studied him. Mom says you ran because you were scared. Daniel nodded. I was. Liam frowned. Are you still scared? Daniel looked at him, at all of them. And then, without hesitation, he shook his head. Not anymore. Days turned into weeks. Daniel wasn't welcome in Emma's home, but the kids, they started meeting him. Small things, grabbing ice cream, sitting in the park, asking about the war, about his life. He told them stories. Some were real, some were less brutal than the truth. But every day they came back. And then, one night, everything changed. It was late when Daniel got the call. Ava had been hit by a car. Daniel didn't remember getting into his truck or driving through the storm. By the time he reached the hospital, Emma was there, furious, broken, scared. You don't get to show up now, she spat. Daniel ignored her. Is she okay? Emma hesitated. She's stable. A pause, then softer. She asked for you. Daniel felt something in him break. Walking into that hospital room, seeing Ava, his daughter, bruised and hooked up to machines, it nearly shattered him. You're here, she mumbled, her voice weak. Daniel sat beside her, holding her small, trembling hand. I'm here, he whispered, and I'm not going anywhere. Ava recovered, slowly. But something changed after that night. Emma stopped fighting so hard to keep him out. She didn't welcome him, but she didn't shut the door in his face either. One evening, as Daniel stood on her porch, she crossed her arms. They don't hate you, she admitted. I do, but they don't. Daniel nodded, accepting the pain. I don't expect you to forgive me. Emma exhaled, looking toward the house, where the kids were laughing inside. Just don't hurt them again, she whispered, because if you do, I swear, Daniel, I'll kill you myself. Daniel swallowed hard. I won't. And for the first time in years, he meant it. Months later, Daniel sat on the porch not as an outsider, but as a father. The kids still had questions, still had wounds. So did he. But he was learning. He wasn't the hero they needed, but he was here. And for the first time since walking away, he finally felt like he belonged. The war inside him wasn't over, but he wasn't fighting it alone anymore. The end.